When a 2-year-old girl sees a sick pit bull in the shelter, she immediately decides she wants to adopt it. Unknown to her, the poor dog has been rejected by everyone because of its looks. But when her mother suggests they look for another pet, the little girl does something unbelievable. Audra had always known her daughter was kind and loving. But when she saw her stop in front of the cage of the saddest, smelliest dog in the shelter, she began to wonder if her daughter was also a bit delusional. Audra had promised little G that she could choose whichever pet she wanted, and couldn't understand why her daughter pointed at this particular one among all the cute dogs in the shelter. Just beside its cage was a German Shepherd puppy with the sweetest eyes she had ever seen. Yet her daughter only had eyes for the sick pit bull. Audra had 2 reasons for disliking the dog G was excitedly pointing at. First, it was a pit bull. She didn't want to be close-minded, but she knew pit bulls were among the strongest, fiercest, and most protective dog breeds. She wasn't sure she would ever feel safe leaving her young daughter alone with such an unpredictable animal. What if it bit her while they played? Even a playful bite could easily break G's delicate fingers. And what if they managed to domesticate it, only for the dog to snap whenever they had guests? What kind of mother would she seem to her friends and family if they saw a morbid-looking beast inside her home? Second, the dog was clearly sick. It smelled terrible. Its eyes and nose were runny, and it was missing patches of fur. To be honest, it didn't resemble the cute dog Audra had imagined when she bundled little G into the car for the trip that would change their lives forever. Audra sighed. Her daughter had been begging for a dog for as long as she could remember. Her first word had literally been doggy. She had fallen in love with animals by watching their neighbor's golden retriever sunbathe on its porch, and had immediately decided she needed a doggy of her own. For months, Audra had simply told her daughter she was too young to take care of a pet. But now that G was 2 and could do things on her own, Audra had run out of excuses. Truth be told, Audra herself liked the idea of having a pet. Not only would a dog be a perfect companion and protector for her daughter, but it would also bring warmth and fun into their home, while giving them more reasons to spend time outside. But she didn't like that dog. What's wrong with it? Audra asked the shelter staff, trying to conceal her disgust. They explained that the pit bull had a bad case of mange and was also battling a respiratory infection. They were giving her medication, but she lacked the strength to fight. Her life hadn't been very happy up until that point. Apparently, the pit bull had been born to 2 champion show dogs, and her owner had been expecting another star to sell at a high price. But instead, they were stuck with a sickly dog whose snout was too wide and coat too brittle. She couldn't be sold, so the poor thing was kicked out as soon as her mother weaned her. A good Samaritan had rescued her, but he was an elderly man who passed away a few months later. His family refused to keep the dog, and she was surrendered to the shelter. She was adopted soon after, but her new owners returned her a week later, saying she did nothing but cry. The shelter staff tried to explain that she had just lost the only person who had ever shown her love, but the family wouldn't listen. They wanted a happy dog, not a grieving one. The rejection only worsened the dog's condition. She was terrified of her kennel. The barking of other dogs frightened her, and she was too shy to socialize. As a result, she kept catching colds. It wasn't until later that the shelter vet discovered the dog had a chronic condition and needed surgery. However, the shelter didn't have the funds to cover the operation, and no potential owner wanted a dog that came with a hefty price tag and uncertain surgery outcomes. The pit bull was rejected once, twice, 3 times more. By the time she turned 1, she had known little else besides the sad-looking walls of her shelter cage. It seemed unlikely that she would ever come out of her shell, and the shelter staff began to fear she would never leave. Worse still, they knew that another bout of illness would land her on the euthanasia list. But then G and her mother walked in. "Doggy sick. Need help," G said, tugging at her mother's dress. Audra was dumbfounded. How did her daughter know the dog was sick? She didn't know what mange was, and the shelter staff hadn't said anything yet. G must have noticed the snot running from the dog's nose and assumed she had a cold. Suddenly, Audra's heart warmed at her daughter's compassion. "Can you please take her out and let her play with my daughter?" Audra asked the shelter staff. A staff member opened the dog's cage and tried to coax the pit bull out, but the poor thing began shaking uncontrollably at the sight of the human approaching her. The dog's terrified whimpers broke Audra's heart. Another staff member grabbed a leash but hesitated, seeing the dog's reaction. What happened next surprised everyone. Little G knelt down, not caring that her pretty dress brushed the shelter floor. She tentatively extended her hand, careful to keep it a few inches away from the dog's face, so as not to frighten her. Audra held her breath as she watched the pit bull's snout inch closer to G's hand. The dog looked weak and harmless, but she was still a dog and could easily bite. Audra was about to pull G away when the dog's little tongue gently brushed her daughter's fingers. G let out a delighted squeal, extending her hand to let the dog sniff and lick it. Surprisingly, the pit bull nuzzled her head into G's hand, allowing her to pet her. The shelter staff were amazed. They had been trying to socialize the dog for months with little success, yet this little girl had spent only a few moments with her and was already petting her. The staff member holding the leash decided to give it a try and gently approached the dog again. This time, the pit bull didn't react fearfully and allowed the leash to be attached. G held the leash, gently tugging to coax the dog out of her cage. To everyone's surprise, the pit bull didn't need to be told twice. She nervously stepped out, glancing around but clearly emboldened by G's presence. The two of them walked around together, with G stopping more than once to clean the dog's runny nose with her dress. Audra couldn't help but smile at the sight. "Mama, this one," G said as she continued playing with the dog. At that moment, Audra realized she was going to adopt the sick, smelly pit bull her daughter had fallen in love with. Sighing, she approached the counter, smiling at the shelter staff's puzzled faces. They too were surprised that the sick pit bull was finally getting adopted. Audra inquired about the surgery the dog needed, its cost, and what she should feed her in the meantime. She already spoke as though the dog were hers. But there was still one hurdle left to clear. Even though shelters are desperate for adopters, they don't just give out animals to the first family that comes through the door. Every prospective owner must be screened to ensure the pet goes to a loving family in a safe environment. Audra understood this and was relieved to see the shelter had a thorough process. She scheduled a home visit for the next day and prepared to leave with G and Tao. However, G wasn't ready to leave her new friend. As soon as the staff member put the dog back into her cage, G burst into tears. "Doggy sick, Mama," she cried. "Need help." "Go home." Audra's heart broke at her daughter's tears. She knelt down and explained that the dog would be theirs the next day after the shelter confirmed they were a good match. It was all for the dog's own well-being, she reassured G. But G didn't want to listen. She kept crying, pointing at the pit bull. Meanwhile, the dog whimpered from her cage. Audra looked at the shelter staff apologetically, preparing to carry G out. However, the expressions on their faces suggested that drastic action wouldn't be necessary. They were so moved by the instant bond between the little girl and the dog that they were willing to bend the rules. One of the staff members volunteered to drive to their house right then for a quick inspection, just to ensure the dog would be in a good home. Audra breathed a sigh of relief as she told G they were taking the dog home. Another staff member hurried to retrieve the pit bull from her cage again, and G rushed to hug her new friend. The pit bull, for her part, immediately stopped shaking as G embraced her. At Audra's home, the shelter worker inspected every room and gave the go-ahead. Audra's house was still baby-proofed, so there were no sharp corners or steep stairs that could pose a danger to the pit bull. Before leaving, Audra asked for the shelter vet's number so she could arrange the dog's surgery as soon as possible. She wanted the pit bull to stop suffering, and, if she were honest, she didn't want her sneezing on the floors anymore. Audra called the vet that very night, and they scheduled the surgery for 3 days later. In the meantime, G proved to be the perfect dog owner. She bathed the pit bull herself, finally ridding her of that awful smell, and made sure she ate exactly the amount the shelter staff recommended. Of course, G snuck her a few extra snacks behind her mother's back. She named the pit bull Scarlet and vowed to always be by her side. When the day of the surgery came, Scarlet looked like a different dog after it was over. Though she still needed time to fully recover and fight off the infections, she seemed ready to fight for her future. She had a real owner now, and little G was her reason to live. 6 months later, Scarlet was unrecognizable. The smelly, sad-looking dog with the runny nose and crusty eyes was gone. Her fur had grown back thicker than ever, her eyes were bright, and her tongue was always out, licking G's hands. Thanks to G's constant companionship, Scarlett even started making friends with the neighbor's golden retriever, the very dog that had inspired G to become a dog owner in the first place. Audra couldn't have been prouder of the decision her daughter had made. G had saved a hopeless dog from a bleak future, and in return, she had gained a friend for life. Audra had once thought pit bulls were aggressive, but Scarlett had proven to be the sweetest soul she'd ever met. Scarlett's protectiveness of G only deepened Audra's love for her. Life was perfect for them, and it was all thanks to G's compassion toward an animal in desperate need of love. Would you adopt a sick dog knowing you'd have to pay for its treatment? What would you say to little G and her mother? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.